Hey everyone, welcome to MuseThemes.com. My name is Steve Harris. Today we're going to take a look at a new widget we've just released called Text Shadows. And what this allows you to do is apply a drop shadow to a text element directly in Muse. Now, drop shadows have always been around on the web and they're really nothing new, but this is quite unique. If we preview this in the browser, I'll show you what's so cool about it. So as you can see, we have a basic shadow applied to this text, but the really cool part of this is if we move our mouse around, the shadow actually follows the mouse. So you can see that the mouse is acting as the light source, and the length and size of the shadow changes as we move our mouse around the page. So this is a really unique effect, and I think it looks best if you use text without a color on it, just the same color as the background itself, and then the shadow almost defines the text itself. So let's go ahead and go into Muse and I'll show you how you make this widget work. So let's delete that out and start from fresh. If we scroll down to our Muse Themes library file, and as you can see, we're on version 7.4.2. At the bottom we have number 22 and it's called Text Shadows, and let's drag that out onto the page. So when we do that and Muse loads a preview, you can see we get a pretty decent preview with this widget. And in the flyout panel here, we have lots of options for customizing the text as well as customizing the shadow itself. So at the moment, let's just touch on how to actually style the text. You do that using the text panel in Muse. So right now we have it set to Montserrat. We could change that font to something different. Let's say Open Sans, and let's go extra bold like that. And as you can see, when you change it in here, the widget's just going to generate a new preview. I'm going to change that back to Montserrat for this. Okay. Now the next thing that we can do is we can change the size of the text. So let's go up to something a little bit bigger. Let's say 90. Okay, and then as I mentioned before, I like to see the color of the text actually the same as the background so that the shadow itself defines it, but you could change the color to anything you wanted. So let's just change this to black. And I'll preview that in the browser so you see how it looks. There, so that's what it looks like with an actual fill applied to the text. So let's go back to Muse, and I'm just going to undo that and change that back to white. And now let's look at the shadow control effects on the widget flyout panel. So the first thing we need to do is you need to input the text to display. So this is what you want to actually see on your site. Right now it's set to Muse themes, but we could change this to anything we wanted. You could say Adobe Muse. And when you put a space in the text here, just be careful because the box itself can wrap the text. Now, the next thing we have is letter spacing. When we built this widget, Muse disabled our ability to control the spacing between letters. So we actually added it into the widget itself. So you can go quite far negative on this if you want a much tighter track text, or you could go to, let's say, 0, which is probably more what you'd see when you just drag this text out onto the page initially. Now we have shadow intensity below that. That's going to be basically how dark and how strong the shadow is. So you can see if we up this to 10, it'll generate a new preview, and it's much darker. And if we preview that on the page or in the browser, you can see that the shadow is much, much more dramatic. Below that, you have the shadow opacity. This is basically how transparent or how see-through the shadow is. So if you went to something like 0.1, and you can think of this in percentages. So 0.1 would be like 10%. Then, we have just this subtle effect, and I'll preview that again. There, so now the shadow is just really subtle and very tasteful. If we went up to something really dramatic, let's say 0.7, let's have a look at that. And you can see now it'll regenerate and it's quite bold. So I'm going to drop that back down to 0.2. Okay, now we have shadow distance. So the distance is going to be how far the shadow will project away from the text. So again, right now it's at 0.2, but let's up this to 0.5 and have a look. Okay, we'll preview that in the browser. There, and as you can see, as I move the mouse around, that the text itself is projecting a much longer shadow than before. And let's go back to Muse, and here we have the final option, which is shadow blur. And so I'm sure you can guess what this is going to be. It's just going to be the blur applied to that shadow. So if you drop this down to something like 10, you're going to get a really harsh, kind of hard shadow on it. And as you can see, it doesn't look very good at this point. So let's up that blur and let's go to something really dramatic, say 90. And now you're going to get a really, really soft blur where you're not seeing individual kind of hard lines against it. So the settings that I had set this at when I initially built the widget was kind of what I thought looked best, but feel free to play with it. And you know what? If you need to go back to the original settings, just delete that out And you can always drag it back on the page, and you'll kind of have back in here what I had set as the default. Now the last couple settings we have here is the shadow color. Let me up the size on this again so you can see it a little bit better. The shadow color allows you to actually change the color that the shadow is projecting. So right now it's set to black, and this uses an RGB value. We had to use RGB on this widget. So for example, we could go 255, 0, 0, and now we should probably get a red shadow as it's RGB, so red, green, and blue. And yes, it's showing a nice red shadow, and let's preview it in the browser, and you can see how it looks. So feel free to play around with the color on that. And the last setting we have here is just the box name. You've seen this before, but this is used for multiple instances of this widget on a page. Now, the thing that you need to pay attention to if you're trying to use multiple versions of this widget is it doesn't quite work with the mouse movement tracking. So if we're going to drag this down, and even if I change the name on this, we could have two different shadow effects applied to this. So let me just change this back to 0. So now we'll get a black shadow on this and a red shadow on this. But unfortunately, when we preview this in the browser, our mouse movement is only tracked on the second box. And that's because both of them can't track at the same time. So that's just something to be aware of. So that's it. That's the text shadows widget. I hope you enjoy it, and I think it's a really outstanding effect that you don't see used on the web very often. So play around with it, try it on this nice white background or on a nice black background, and feel free to send us examples of what you make. Thanks again, and best of luck.